Welcome to the first lecture of Psychology 220 Research Methods and Inferential Statistics. And we're mainly going to be focusing on scientific methodology and research methods in this class, and then specifically the first major tool in investigating scientific theories, which is the correlation. And also basically data analysis and how we handle data and how we use data to address questions of psychology, human behavior. So my name is Joel T. Nadler. I'm a professor of psychology, specifically industrial organizational psychology. I got my PhD in 2010 in applied psychology with a specialization in advanced statistics and industrial organizational psychology, which I'll get into in a little bit. As far as the structure of the class itself, we'll handle that in other modalities. This is mainly just kind of an introduction to the class and really kind of an introduction to psychological science in general. So I've thrown up a bunch of images here, just kind of a snapshot or a collage of things that I've liked or enjoy. I'm an avid pet owner. I have cats, both indoor and outdoor. I have dogs, though actually I'm a little saddened when I look at this picture because it is a little dated. All four of the dogs pictured have passed since that picture, though we still have multiple dogs. And as of recently, we also own horses. I have a single son. His name is Raymond. Again, this is kind of a dated picture of him there in the lower corner, as he is now 18 and preparing to go into the military. So anyway, my experiences as an instructor here at SIUE, I have taught this class multiple times, both online and in person. And I also often am teaching the graduate statistics classes. So anyway, let's go ahead and move on to what we're really talking about in this class, which is kind of scientific methodology as applied to psychology. So why research methods in general is also the question of why use scientific methodology to study human behavior. And that's what makes psychology different than other fields. It's not that it is the only way to understand human behavior. In fact, we've been trying to understand human behavior since the dawn of time. It is specifically, though, the science, ology, of applying scientific methodology to that study. So systematic, purposeful study to look for trends. And that's the other thing that I want to say is that when we're talking about studying human behavior, most of the time, the best we're going to be able to do is say that given a situation, the majority of people will tend to act this way. And I think that's one of the misconceptions people often have about psychology, because a lot of the sciences, we often refer to them as the hard sciences, are basically, so mathematics, physics, chemistry, are looking at phenomena that are very predictable. If you know the altitude, if you know the humidity, and you know the amount of heat, basically, chemistry and physics can tell you when water will boil. There are variants there. If you have contaminants in the water, if you're different altitudes, the answer might be slightly different, but it is almost completely predictable if you have enough information. When we come to human behavior, probably human behavior is similar, it's just much more complex to where we often don't have all of the information. In other words, a psychologist is being asked, when will someone boil over, without getting additional information as far as potential contaminants, so past experiences, past personality, past conflicts, past ways of dealing with trauma, not necessarily knowing the barometric pressure, so the entire situation that person's in, but still being asked to make a prediction. And that doesn't mean that the predictions are automatically invalid. It means they're less likely to be true. Not that they're not likely to be true, just less likely. So where a hard science might be able to answer a question, I need to know 6 things, and if I know those 6 things, I can give you an answer that pretty much will be 100% accurate all of the time. A psychologist is often in a position of, I need to know hundreds of things to give you a 100% prediction. Unfortunately, all I know are 3, but based on those 3, I can still give you a better than odds chance of predicting how someone's going to behave. So in that way, psychology is fairly similar to some fields like meteorology. A lot of people like to pick on weathercasters, and we know every time we see something like 45% chance of rain and it doesn't rain, we go, what is even the point? Except we need to recognize what that person is saying is that based on all of the information I have, 45% of the time, a day like today will involve rain. And if we actually looked at multiple days that all looked like that, what we would find is about 45% of the time it does rain. In other words, meteorology is about giving you a better than average chance of guessing what's going to happen, of predicting what's going to happen, and also recognizing the variability or the error that is in that prediction. It's very rare that a weather person will ever tell you 100% chance unless it's already raining. But when they tell you 90% of the chance, if you looked at all the days that year they said 90%, you'd find 9 out of 10 of those days it rained. And that's where psychology kind of exists too. That can we predict how someone's going to behave with 100% accuracy? Absolutely not. But can we predict human behavior through science better than just guessing on using other methods? And the answer to that is also yes. So the scientific methods to study human behavior include a lot of different ways and a lot of different fields of psychology. And this also includes how they're actually being used. So a lot of research that is done in psychology, the science of human behavior, is focused on therapy, helping individuals. How can we predict how someone will behave in a certain situation or under certain stressors, and how can we make it more likely that behavior will actually be to the advantage of that person and not maladaptive? Behavior and learning. So how can we change behavior in a non-clinical setting? How can we actually evaluate how people perform, for example, in workplace settings, at home, in relationships, and also how can we increase the likelihood of someone successfully learning material? Developmental psychology, so how people develop. In other words, the changes when you're dealing with someone that's 7 years old versus someone that's 14-year-old, someone that's 24-year-old, or someone that's 70 years old. How do those differences in their developmental process change their likelihood to behave one way or another? We can look at human resources, and that also gets to that last item I added at the end, industrial organizational psychology. So applying all this information to making workplaces better, to make people more productive, and to make organizations more likely to retain top talent. A lot of research in human behavior is in the fields of social psychology and cognitive psychology. And this kind of is the big two, in my opinion. In fact, a lot of places are now calling this social cognitive psychology. So social psychology is really looking at the impact of the situation on human behavior. And we find that actually in a lot of situations, it's more important to know about the situation you're in than to know about you as the person. In other words, whether you're extremely extroverted or extremely introverted, if I put you in a very loud dance party environment, probably both people will behave somewhat similarly. And also, if I put both people in a very controlled, quiet library, their behaviors are going to be similar. In other words, individual differences tend to shine when there isn't a strong social pressure. And because in a lot of situations that we're in, there is a strong social pressure to how you're supposed to behave, social psychology is an important part of figuring out human behavior. Cognitive psychology more focuses on the internal processes of how we process information internally, how we think about it, how we gather information, and how the brain actually functions. And between the two of these are probably the two biggest things that you want to know if you want to try to predict one person's behavior. You'd want to know their past experiences and how they think internally, cognitive psychology, and you'd want to know what situation they're currently in, social psychology. So as far as the sources of knowledge, so how do we gather information about human behavior? There are multiple ways. One of them is superstition, beliefs, chance, magic. And I really do want to start out by saying that I am not bad-mouthing superstition. Superstition is basically science without the process. Where superstitions come from is from observation. People are watching their world. They're looking for things that occur. And once they see them occur, they're trying to figure out why did they occur. And outside of using a scientific methodology, a lot of times that notice is chance. So for example, if the first time you ever saw a black cat, you trip and hurt yourself, you start to go, what was different about that situation? Well, it wasn't me. I'm usually not clumsy. But, well, there was a black cat, And then a week later, someone says, yeah, I was working on a roof on a house and I fell off. Was there anything different about the situation? You ask curiously, and they say, actually, right before I fell, I saw a black cat. Suddenly, it starts to click. And instead of testing, do black cats actually cause accidents, a superstition is born. Superstitions can occur on cultural levels, historical levels, and individual levels. If any of you have a lucky shirt or a lucky item that you tend to associate with doing well, I can tell you as a fact that there were first 2 dates that I went on that were successful, I was wearing the same shirt. For a little while, anytime I'd go on a date, I'd wear that shirt. That's a superstition. Intuition is unaware of the source. It's a gut feeling, and intuition can often be correct. Intuition often is telling us that we're processing information without being aware of it, and again, we may be coming up with the right answer, but we may not. Because intuition, again, it isn't putting it to the test. It's simply allowing our unconscious minds to kind of try to put together the pieces and look for a pattern. And that's one thing to recognize about human behavior. One of the things we've learned through cognitive psychology and the research of psychology is that we as people tend to look for patterns. And we'll often settle on a pattern probably way earlier than we should because we want to find those patterns. Patterns help us predict how the world's going to work, and we like to be able to do that. You want to know what to expect when you walk into a restaurant. You want to know what to expect when you walk into a new class. That's a desire for patterns. That's a desire for comfort and for safety. And because of that, we often rely on superstition or intuition, which is basically unconscious superstition, to look for those patterns and to settle on patterns quickly without putting them to the test. We can also gain knowledge through authorities. We can gain it from authority figures, and those authority figures may actually be giving us good information. They may not. A lot of what you're learning in this class is not being learned through experimentation. You're learning it from an authority figure, myself. I'm telling you my knowledge, and I'm hoping that you accept my credentials and the fact that I'm here to hopefully give you a better look at the world and a better understanding of psychological processes. But again, we have to ask, do we put it to the test? If you do, you're moving away from these other sources to actual science. If you don't just accept it, that in itself is just accepting knowledge from authority. And again, sometimes, just like superstition or intuition, it can result in the right answer. And sometimes, as long as you check where that authority is coming from and ask yourself, do they have alternative motives, it may even be a better method than intuition and superstition, assuming the authority went through the scientific methodology to figure out this answer. Tenacity just means a repeated idea we're clung to. In other words, it may have been supported in the past, it may have survived initial testing, but no one's putting it to the test again, and we're just accepting it as truth because it's always been accepted as truth. Now, finally, we get to the two that are most important for science, and that's rationalism and empiricism. So that's the ones that I really want to focus on because this is the foundations of science. Rationalism means that we're going to start with logical reasoning. What logical reasoning is we're going to try to basically, just through thought exercise and knowledge, make sure that we're not wasting our time testing things. So for example, we might actually decide, you know what, the chances of a black cat actually causing mischief and supernatural effects is fairly unlikely. Let's see if there's anything that makes logical sense that might have been the result of these accidents that we can test. So logical reasoning and rationalism is basically the understanding that we expect the world to behave in a cause and effect chain, that the things that happen in the world happen for a reason. And we may not understand the reason, but we can think about what would be a logical answer to why something would happen. So we're going to create our initial questions using rationalism. And rationalism is going to draw from superstition, intuition, authority, and tenacity. That's where rationalism starts. What is a pattern that we think we're seeing? But before we directly start to test it, we're also going to put it to a logical test. Does it make sense? Does it logically reason or follow that this cause would result in this effect? And if it is, then maybe we want to test it. And that's empiricism. Empiricism is the direct observation and testing. So for example, if we really wanted to know if black cats caused bad luck, we would probably set up a test of direct observation. We would put people into situations where they could either succeed or fail, and we'd change whether or not a black cat was there, a brown cat was there, or a mouse was there, and we'd see if there's any differences. And if we found that people that were in the black cat condition constantly actually underperformed and everyone else overperformed, that wouldn't necessarily say black cats cause bad luck, but it would say black cats are at least associated with that effect. And that's another part of rationalism and empiricism, is not jumping to a conclusion. We haven't showed that black cats cause bad luck. It could be what we're capturing would be a confound, and that confound being, and a confound is basically an alternative answer to our question that we didn't account for in our study. An alternative answer in this question might be, the black cat still has no special power. However, the people in our study were so fearful of black cats because they were aware of the superstition that that's what resulted in their underperformance. And a way we could try to then test that is an additional experiment. We could then set up an experiment where we find people that have never heard about the superstition of black cats, and we put them through the experiment. And if we found that they did not have underperformance in the black cat condition, that would tell us something. That would tell us that black cats do have an effect, but only on people that already believe they're going to cause misfortune. So anyway, moving forward, one of the things I really want you to focus on is the ideas of rationalism and empiricism as the foundations of where we start when we're trying to do scientific experiments in psychology. Is our hypotheses or our research questions logical? And once they are, we want to put them under direct observation to test them. We don't want to be in the trap of superstition, just believing it because we believe it, or intuition because we have a feeling, or even authority because we were told to believe it, or tenacity because we were told it's the way it's always been. We want to ask, is it logical? And if it is logical, let's put it to the test. So we keep going back and forth between ideas and experience, and this is both personally and scientifically. So if you think of your own life, your entire life, you have been basically your own little pocket scientist, if you will. You have had ideas about how the world works, and you've created categories, you've created themes, you've created basically a structure for dealing with the world. All of us have had experience with different types of movies, and we know whether or not we like those types of movies. So most people can tell you what movies they like and what they don't. Maybe they like comic book movies or action adventure. Maybe they dislike dramas. Maybe they like comedies but don't like horror movies. Or maybe they love horror movies but they don't like action adventure. Those are categories. And where do those categories come from? Well, the categories probably came from authority figures, intuition, superstition, what you heard before you ever saw a movie. And then you went to see a movie. You did an observation. So let's say your friends talked you into watching a big budget action adventure film. So you had your preconceptions, your ideas. You now have your experience. You go and watch the film. You've observed it. Now you need to revise. You need to decide, is this something I like? And maybe the answer is yes. So you start to get a positive opinion of this category. And now you can predict that if I go to see other big budget action adventure films, I'll probably like them as well. But you may actually decide, actually, I didn't like this. So you come back and go, okay, action adventure films aren't something I want. I'm going to predict that in the future, if I saw other action adventure films, I wouldn't like them. And therefore, I'm going to start avoiding them. Now recognize that a lot of times these processes can happen very quickly and are very dependent on those first observations. So for example, I'm going to stick with my action adventure films. So let's say the very first film you see is now I have to come up with an example, but let's just say an action adventure film that did not do very well. Actually, I'm a big fan of action adventure films, so it's a little hard for me to think of one that's poor, but let's say you went to one that just wasn't very good. And so your observation is, well, I really didn't enjoy that. And then if that's the very first one you ever saw, you're probably going to start avoiding them. You're going to predict, well, I'm not going to like these, which means that you're going to avoid them, and you start to create basically a superstition. I don't like action adventure films, when that's based on one single observation. Likewise, it may be that you're really not someone that likes action adventure films, but the first one you ever see is just a great film. You really enjoy it. It's got a good story, it's got a good plot line, and even though the action adventure part isn't that great as far as you're concerned, you still decide, oh wow, I really like this. Maybe I like these films. So you start going to more because you're predicting that you will. But then none of them are as good as that first one. A lot of them are kind of like Michael Bay Transformer movies. It's all special effects, no story, and you start to revise your theory. Okay, actually it turns out I don't like these films. So you can recognize through that process alone that the process of going from ideas, our preconceptions, our thoughts, what we gather before we actually get observations, the experience of actually observing this new phenomenon or this new thing creates this process where we revise our categories, but we also use those categories to predict how we're going to behave or what we're going to like or dislike in the future. And this can be everything from movies to people to dating to cars. We do this with just about everything. Science does it as well, but does it more systematically and purposefully, and tries to not to jump to those conclusions. It tries to use the idea of ideas, research questions and hypotheses, to take them to experiences, actual observations, empiricism, and then ask the question, is this an honest test of our original idea? And if it isn't, we need to do more tests before we make a conclusion. So again, this process is an iterative process, and what iterative means is that it's constantly ongoing and it's constantly being revised. It's one of the reasons you'll often sometimes hear people say that theories are never proven, and that's somewhat correct. Now, there are many theories that basically are the foundations of our science. It would be very unlikely they'd be disproved, but science by its nature says we should always leave the door open for further testing, further observations, and further understanding. And when we're talking about human behavior, we actually have to really truly recognize that because human behavior is very much affected by experiences, education, development, and the culture and social situations that we're in, that as development, as education, as cultural expectations change, behaviors may change as well. For example, if you looked at behavior of men to women in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, both in film and in real world environments, and especially in the workplace, you would create very different theories of how to predict that behavior than if you were looking at the interaction between men and women in workplaces, movies, and everyday life today. Because our expectations of those behaviors, our understanding of the difference between men and women have greatly changed, both scientifically, but also culturally and personally. So the ideas in that past slide, we were mainly talking about how we do this just naturally. But with psychology, we want to create an actual psychological theory. In other words, the first step of taking it from just a process of looking at categories to ideas and then observations and experiences is to actually ask very meaningful questions. And a psychological theory is that. It's a statement that is about the causal relationship between two or more variables that concern people, their thought processes, or their behavior. So the statement part means that's where that rationalism comes in. We're creating a rational statement that we can test. It's a testable statement. That testable statement is going to be about a causal relationship. In other words, we're going to be making statements about if you have this personality trait, we expect you to behave in this way. Or if you're in this particular situation, we expect you to behave this way. That causal relationship is usually going to be termed in terms of variables. So variables are basically quantitative, for the most part, measurements of the constructs that we're interested in. Constructs gets into its own thing, but a construct basically is a psychological idea. So for example, extroversion is a construct. It is not something we can put on a scale. It's not something we can measure, but we all know when I say someone's extroverted, we understand that person is outgoing, that person likes to talk, that person likes to be around people. If I say someone doesn't have a lot of extroversion or is introverted, we understand that that means the person is more withdrawn, they don't tend to talk a lot, they may not have as many friends. That's a variable. And people can be extremely extroverted, somewhat extroverted, a mix of extroversion and introversion, a little bit introverted, or very introverted, and that's how that varies. So for instance, we might have a statement about the causal relationship between extroversion and introversion and the number of friends someone has. The number of friends is another variable. That can vary between 0, no friends, and hundreds of friends. So again, that would be a statement, a causal relationship between two or more variables, and it does concern people, their thought process, and their behavior. People that are extroverted are more likely to have a greater number of friends. That was a statement about a causal relationship between two variables, extroversion, the level of it, and friendship, the number of them. So think of that whenever you're creating a psychological theory, what you're really doing is creating a statement that can be tested about a causal relationship between variables. And very specifically for this class, you will be very shortly creating your own psychological theory, specifically a hypothesis, a single testable statement, about a causal relationship between two variables. One of those variables being job satisfaction, and the other variable is under your control. What variable or human behavior or situation or input do you think would rather result in someone being either more happy or less happy with their job? So again, we're coming back to that original slide, a couple slides back, where we were talking about moving from ideas to observations. That same process from theory to research looks like this, and it's referred to as an operational definition. And an operational definition is when we're moving from the land of theory and constructs to an actual experiment. So my example here is that operational definition, we start in the land of ideas. We start with a rational statement. And that rational statement may be that the more frustrated someone becomes, the more likely they are to exhibit aggression. So that is a psychological theory. That's a statement. That's a statement saying that frustration is causally related to aggression. And the more you frustrate someone, the more aggressive they get. Where operationally defining it comes in is when we move it from the land of theory and idea to the land of observation. So operational definition, the definition of operational definition, if you will, is how do you operationalize constructs, theories, into an actual experiment. So as we move it down to observations, we're not just going to watch people and guess whether they are frustrated and guess whether they're aggressive. We're going to set up an experiment. We're going to basically set up an experiment where we tell someone they can leave, but when they try to leave, we block them. In other words, we don't physically attack them, we simply get in their way. And every time they try to move around us, we move around them as well. The more we do this, we basically are blocking their actions to the door. And what we're assuming is that these blocking actions in this experiment are representing frustration. That the longer we block, the more frustrated the person becomes. Now, our operation of aggression may be that once the person is finally allowed past us, that they are more likely to slam the door than if we didn't. So really what we're doing is we're setting up a very simple experiment. We bring a single person into a lab. We close the door. We then do an unrelated experiment for 10 minutes with them. We tell them that it's fine, they can leave, we're done with them. Half of the time, randomly assigned, the people are just allowed to leave. And when they leave, we use a little audio recording device to record how loud the noise of the door closing is. In the other half of condition, randomly determined, we purposely block them from getting to the door. Again, it's not aggressive, we don't yell at them, we don't say anything, just we get in their way. And we keep getting in their way. It's kind of that back and forth of like, they take a step to the right, we accidentally take a step to the right. We do this until they finally get annoyed and move past us, and then we record the sound of the door closing. If we notice that people in the blocking action condition closed the door much loudly, in other words, they slammed it, we could start to say our operational definition of frustration and aggression is frustration is being defined as our blocking actions, and aggression is being measured through the sound or how loud they slammed the door. So our prediction is that if frustration causes aggression, then blocking action should result to louder closings of the door, louder slammings. Now this is a kind of a simple little thought experiment, if you will, but I really want you to keep this in mind, that whenever we're talking about moving from the other methods of knowing the world, intuition, superstition, authority, etc., to actual science, we're starting with rationalism. What is a rational statement? What's a theory? Frustration equals aggression. That seems to make sense. It seems to fit a lot of observations many of us have had. Now we need to operationally define it into an actual controlled experiment, in this case, blocking actions and slamming. Now notice there are many other ways you could operationally define frustration, and there are many other ways you could operationally define aggression. For example, I actually ran an experiment once where we were actually testing a new measure of aggression. And what we basically did was two conditions. In one condition, people were simply asked to reflect on a very peaceful and happy situation from their relationships. They were basically said, I want you to spend 5 minutes thinking of some of the happiest events that have occurred in your relationship. In the other condition, we told people to spend 5 minutes thinking about the most frustrating and annoying fights that they had had in their relationship. After this, both groups were asked to play a 5-minute video game that measured how many times they attacked civilians, because they could. That was how we operationalized frustration. We had them self-reflect either positively or negatively on a relationship that would have resulted in potentially less or more frustration. And how we measured aggression was the number of attacks they did on civilians in a video game that we had control over and scoring afterwards. And again, the hypothesis was the same. Frustration results in aggression. And our prediction was the same. If frustration causes aggression, then thinking about frustrating events will result in greater aggression in a video game.